Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Programs broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Tuesday, May 16th, 2023. Tonight's format, if you're not familiar with it, is a live Q&A. So current and former parents or alumni of our program can attend these broadcasts and submit questions throughout the broadcast. You can always submit questions or topics, even if you're not an alumni, to webinar@evoketherapy.com. You can submit those at any time. We'll collect those. Those will go at the top of the queue, and then you can listen or watch on the next broadcast on YouTube to look at me, to watch or listen to me answer the questions. So having said that, before I get into the questions that have come in for this evening, I just want to let you, those that are watching and listening, know that I'm about to host our third, I think it's the third version of our conscious parenting workshop. This is a workshop where we keep it limited in terms of its attendance, the overall numbers, so that it can be more of a dialogue. You can ask specific questions of me more easily. You'll be on video with other parents. You can also dialogue and hear from other parents. So it's a day-long workshop. It's 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. with an hour for lunch. Those are mountain times on June 9th. So if you're interested in that, contact intensives at evoketherapy.com to find out more information to register. It's $400 for individuals, and it's $700 for a shared screen if there are two parents. So I really look forward to that. The first few couple have been fantastic so far. Let me get into the questions that have been submitted this evening, and I'll get right to it. The first question reads, can you talk about transition plans out of residential treatment center to home? We're stuck on the contingency plan if our son's relapse is ineffective. I'm worried about overreacting to triggers. That's a fantastic and very difficult question. I do have a contract or outlines for a contract. I'm reluctant to talk about contract and zero tolerance policies because I think that the process is much more nuanced and subtle than that. So that's one of the difficulties with this. But I love what you're thinking already. Watching out for your triggers, watching out for overreacting. For the most part, when I talk to parents about relapse prevention or responding to their child's struggles, I talk about paying attention to your relapse prevention, paying attention to your old triggers, paying attention or identifying what for you would cause you to flip your lid, as they say, to go into that fight or flight mode. My thoughts are it's not going to be perfect. My thoughts are that it's going to be a struggle. Even when things I think are deemed successful in terms of a child's stay in treatment, I think it's still challenging and difficult. I've said this before. Even when you have a child that doesn't rise to the threshold of needing out of home placement, it still is challenging as a parent. I talk about the idea often that parenting is one of those impossible tasks, impossible roles that you are sure to fail at almost more than any other role in your life that you'll fail at. And it's also arguably the most important role that you'll ever be in your life. So I think learning to take it slow, learning to distinguish between I really love what somebody shared with me a long time ago. The difference between a flare up and a relapse. A flare up is old behaviors coming up. Relapse into drugs, lying, refusing to go to school. Those are flare ups, as I had this person describe it to me. Relapse, this is again one person's definition. Relapse is more of an old way into the thinking, an old way into the old patterns, an unwillingness to learn, to rebound from the mistakes, to pick oneself back up and to re-engage the treatment process. So I would distinguish between flare-ups, that one or two or three off, one-off behavior, to relapse where you're going back into old patterns and old thinkings. I like the idea of having contingency plans if it gets to that point, so you don't feel like you're helpless, putting things in your back pocket. Talking to the therapist that you're working with in residential. I think every therapist should be able to help a family ramp up to that task of transitioning back home so that you have plans or contingencies. But I'll say this, and I think I've felt this for more than 10 years, but now I feel it more in my bones. And that is, I don't really think of things in terms of a zero tolerance policy. I think if things can be managed, it becomes for the parent, have you done enough? And you're the one that gets to answer that question. My son came home from wilderness therapy and from residential treatment center. And at some point, I would say he was in a full blown relapse. And I contacted an educational consultant, not the same one that I had for the original placement, because this was a couple of years later. I talked to a program, and I literally, not figuratively or metaphorically, I literally had the phone number of the person that would start the intervention if I felt like we were at a point of no return in terms of him being home and being successful. And I had that in my back pocket. So I like having that plan. And I think if things rise to that level and you're still able to make those kinds of decisions, for me, that was a point of comfort. I put it in my wallet and carried it in my back pocket. What I've said, if you've heard me talk about the story, within a couple of weeks, within 2 weeks of putting that in my back pocket, my son came to me and said one of his primary issues was substance use. Came to me and said, I've recently gotten sober. I've talked to my friends and I've made this decision for myself. And he's been sober for the 16 years since. So having that contingency plan, talking to your consultant, talking to your residential treatment therapist, talking about that I call it the nuclear option, meaning that you've exhausted all of the steps, right? The in-home consequences and boundaries that you might have for behavior. What I can tell you shifting forward in my own process, and I'm not telling you what you should do or shouldn't do. I want to be as clear about that as I can when I tell you this story. I'm not telling you that my story is the right way to do it, but I will tell you with my youngest, who's 16 years younger than my oldest, with my youngest, what I've done with her is I've made the consequences manageable around behavior. I've decided that it's going to be a fight that I have to fight in terms of her safety, her any experimentation that you might have with substances, grades in school, and so forth. Um, and that the consequences are, I have a lot more small and medium consequences. I've focused on, my wife and I have focused on that, and I haven't made them over the top. I haven't thought of it as I I think the difference is when I was younger, I thought I could control my child's behavior. Ultimately, I really did. Even though if you had asked me, I would have denied it. I really thought that, or that I could in the future prevent the need for an intervention. The difference today is I look at it as an ongoing parent child. I don't want to say battle because that sounds like we're in an adversarial relationship, but I'm in an adversarial relationship with some of the behaviors that she might be prone to exhibit. So in that sense, I've bought into this idea that it's going to be difficult, it's going to be painful, it's going to be a battle internally. It's going to be something that's not going to go away. We're not going to arrive, and I'm going to kind of see how far we can get before her prefrontal cortex grows in, right? Before her brain becomes an adult brain, before she goes to hopefully to college and can kind of experiment within those ranges, within those boundaries there. So I don't have a perfect answer about what to do, but those are some of my thoughts about it. I hope that's helpful. Thanks for the question. Somebody writes, we have a son who will be transitioning out of wilderness in a few weeks. He's 17 and will turn 18 soon. We have been struggling about giving him agency during the process versus directing influencing the decision as it relates to the next steps, attending a therapeutic boarding school or young adult program. We would love to hear your thoughts on parenting through this process. Gosh, I probably haven't done a broadcast on this in far too long. In fact, I'll tell Sarah, why don't we add that to the queue so I can do one coming up relatively soon. And I'll share with some of my thoughts with you about that. The more I used to say to my students in the wilderness, the more demanding you get about treatment in terms of what it sounds like when I say demanding is I have to have this. This is a requirement. And oftentimes those things that they say that they have to have are fairly superficial. They're talking about their own clothes or their music, things like that. When I hear young people talk in those terms, I'm reluctant to give them more say in the matter. More of a To encourage the parents, I should say, to give the child more of a vote in the matter. But I always think it's appropriate to ask a child what they want and need for aftercare. Even if you're not going to give it to them, it gives you a measure of what they're thinking about, what they value. When clients start to say, I want to go home, but I realize what a challenge it would be, or that I might not be successful, I might fall back into old patterns. That's ironically, paradoxically, when I encourage the parents to give the child more of a vote, more of a say. I guess I'm looking for some kind of what they refer to in addiction and recovery culture as surrender. I'm looking for a surrender. I'm looking for a humility. I'm looking for a healthy respect about the challenges in front of them. And so the more that they display those kind of characteristics, features, the more I encourage the parents to give them more of a vote, but always, always asking a child. A very common assignment that we give is, write down your needs and your wants list. You kind of your if you could wave a magic wand, what you would have, and then what you need, and kind of see where their head is at. See how maturely they're considering the process. I think for parents and children alike, there is one thing that I pay attention to, and this goes back to the previous question about transitioning home, is if there's not a healthy respect for the challenges, when people say, I'm confident, I'm not going to fall back into old patterns, I'm sure of it, I'm not worried about that, I'm committed, I'm motivated, versus when they say, it's going to be hard, I'm nervous, I'm actually worried and a little bit scared of coming home and getting back in to those old relationships or those old contexts. I trust the latter more than the former, right? This stuff is hard. Improving our lives, making changes, getting out of old patterns, out of old ways of coping, old behaviors, extricating ourselves from old relationships that have certain behaviors and expectations and dynamics to them. Those are very, very difficult things. So I'm looking for surrender. I'm looking for a healthy respect for the challenges ahead. The more the child has that attitude of surrender and that healthy respect, the more I encourage parents to give them a vote in the say. Now, if your child is turning 18, which it sounds like your child might be turning 18 from your question, in some ways, legally, to get some kind of buy-in so that they won't walk away, you're walking a finer line, right? Part of the buy-in for the 18-year-old, because they can walk away, can be a little bit more of a vote. So again, on the scales of how to negotiate it, that tips the scale more towards the child having a say. In the end, one of the things I've taught, regardless, if you can do this, if you can come up with 2 or 3 options based on talking to your consultant and doing your due diligence, if you can come up with 2 or 3 options for a child that you feel okay about, that you feel good about, if you can present 2 or 3 options to a child, even one that might be less motivated, again, you're getting some buy off and sign off in it. Now, let me be clear. I don't mean one that you feel really good about and 2 that you feel sort of good about, and the third one you really don't want them to go to. I'm not talking about that. You have to feel okay with if you're going to present them as choices and kind of give them that decision making power and the related buy-in that comes from that, then that has to be real. What I will say is, don't try to sell them on it. When I had parents talk about either the final choice or the options, if they're giving them options, I would always say, for every time that you find yourself saying something positive in the spirit of trying to sell it to your child, tell them something you think they might not like about that program, just to check yourself, just for some balance. But the biggest mistake that I hear parents make in this process is them trying to sell the decision for aftercare period or sell a specific aftercare program and not making the decision or owning up to, owning that decision. So if you can't come up with more than one that you feel good enough about, then don't give them two choices. Don't give them three choices. That's my thought about that. Somebody writes this question. Thank you for that question. Somebody writes, I'm hearing a lot of talk about awakening. It is difficult to understand. Any thoughts? It seems like it's just a lot about feeling your feelings and letting go. The people who have been awakened just seem to have trouble defining it. Just curious. That's a great question. I feel like that was seeded by somebody on my team because it's something that I would love to talk about. I think awakening is an awareness of what has been previously unconscious. See, here's the thing. The way that we think about therapy at Evoke and the way that I think about therapy at Evoke or therapy in general is that so much of what drives our behavior is unconscious. From our history, from our past, big traumas, small traumas. And so much of what is driving our lives is our unconscious. Carl Jung, the great Carl Jung, said that until the unconscious become conscious, people will just they'll just refer to their life's journey as fate, something outside of their control. So awakening is becoming aware of what's unconscious. It can be as simple as being able to decipher an unconscious sarcastic comment, a passive aggressive comment. One of the things that our children will say as you call it, awaken, is that they realize when they go home, they realize that what people are saying often and how people are behaving is not really what they're thinking and feeling. Because what happens in wilderness, I've said this for many years, but I haven't used this example for this analogy for many, many years. You're walking along with a child on the trail in wilderness, and you can tell that they're in some kind of funk, right? They're sad, discouraged. Maybe they got a letter. Maybe something happened this morning. Maybe they're just homesick, whatever it is. And they end up snapping at somebody. Or maybe that's the first time that you notice that they might be in a funk. They snap at somebody. They become sarcastic. They lash out at somebody verbally. And you'll pause and say to them, might even call a standing group where we just pause and all stand in a circle and we say to little Susie or Johnny, we say, what's going on? How are you feeling? And of course, the typical answer is nothing. Now, the reason they say nothing is because in the past, when they've answered that question, it has answered that question, it hasn't gone well for them. That's just to put in your awareness. Nothing, they say. It's no big deal. I just got annoyed. And then we wait. And we continue to ask that question. We ask it later on that evening. We ask it the next morning. Eventually, when the child feels safe and down-regulated enough, not too triggered, they'll tell us, I was just feeling sad and homesick. Or this was the third time that my peer, so-and-so, didn't help with the chores in the morning. And I brought it up to him or her or them a few times, and they just blew me off. Right? I talked to the staff about it, and they told me to mind my own business or whatever it was. And so after a while, they start to understand that these behaviors, I'll call it acting out. That's probably too large of a term. But they start to see what's really driving behavior. Part of it is about being honest with yourself. The other day, I won't get into the details, but I left something here. Left a little mess. And I could have gotten away with it. It was subtle enough that it didn't look like it could have been mine. It looked like it could have been an accident. And even the person who left the mess might not have even known. And my wife said to me, she asked me to clean it up. Not because she thought it was mine, but just because she asked me to help with it. And I said to her, after I cleaned it up, I said to her in a moment of what I would call courageous honesty, I said, I was the one who did that. I was the one who left that mess. And she said, "Thanks for admitting that. Thanks for." I mean, it's. I know that seems trivial and small, but that's the awakening. It's understanding that it's not necessarily being able to change all of your behavior right away. That's more than an awakening. That's awakening. That's discipline after a lot of work and a lot of courageous choices. But it's becoming aware of the truth. Like you said, it's what you feel, what other people are feeling. Understanding the difference between a question and a statement when you're communicating. Understanding and your own accountability in your own unhappiness. Understanding how guilt and shame play into your boundaries. You might not be able to still set clear boundaries, but you know it's coming from a place of guilt and shame. You know it's coming from a place of conditioning. So you start to become aware of and more conscious of what's driving your behavior, and eventually you're able to own up to it to yourself and own up to it to the people around you. You're not fighting about the same things that never resolve themselves. You're not having the same arguments. You feel less apt to defend yourself because when you've made contact with when you have a relationship with your authentic self, when you feel safe enough to be who you are, there's no need for a defense. So awakening is for sure on a continuum. It doesn't mean all the behavior changes, but it's greater and greater awareness of unconscious processes, both in yourself and in other people. It comes with honesty. There's courage mixed in there. There's humility for sure, because most awakened people will admit on a regular basis how what a buffoon they are, how silly they can be, how defended they can be. Right? Awakening often looks like somebody that can talk about, laugh at themselves, and can talk about their mistakes, their fallibilities more easily. There's a sense of safety that they carry around with them internally. So there's a lot of things to it. I think another broadcast that you might listen to is the one that I talked about. That's entitled "What is the work and how do we do it? How do you do it?" That I did a few weeks ago. Sarah can post that link here if you want to. That might go into longer detail about what I think is talked about when there's an awakening. There's a humility. People that are woke are oftentimes arrogant and judgmental. I don't think that's the same as an awakening. Right? They can be rigid and punishing, but real awakening, not wokeness, but real awakening. And I'm talking about that in a neutral political sense from either side. Um, Awakening as opposed to wokeness, there's a humility, there's a compassion. An awakening also has a lot of self-compassion and compassion for others. And I talk about this a little bit on these broadcasts, and definitely talk about it in my books, but that's what most of the hero's journey, the idea that Joseph Campbell came up with, where he said that all myths, religions, and stories, epic stories, are telling the same story about a transformation of consciousness. That heroic journey is about awakening. I'll say one last thing about it before I move on to the next question. Awakening is most importantly becoming who you really are, your most authentic self. Who you are or were before the world, before everybody told you who you should be. So you've had some success significantly of battling shame and guilt. One of my favorite quotes is that becoming who you are is the most difficult thing in life. Somebody wrote. So I would call it that also. Thanks for posting that, Sarah. Somebody writes, is there a common attachment style between parents of adopted children, parents and children style? Um, I haven't thought about it, and this is not research based, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I would say it tends to be anxious, avoidant. Or excuse me. Um, it tends to be anxious, ambivalent. There's a lot of anxiety with adopted parents because there's oftentimes a fear, right? There's oftentimes been a lot of work and a lot of heart that's gone into the adoption or the attempt to have their own children. So there's been sacrifices, there's been longing, there's been hoping, there's been prayers, there's been a lot. Um, Often families aren't larger when they are adopted. When there's an adopted child, there might be just the one child, or maybe two. And so when we put all of our eggs in that one child's basket, that's a lot of pressure for them and for us. We are oftentimes trying to make up for the original wound of being put up for adoption. We think we need to make up for it. Another thing that's really interesting is because the adopted child doesn't have the same genetics in most cases, of course. In some cases there could be one, there's other possibilities, but adoption by its general definition, the genetics are from a different genetic pool. And so the way that they think and look can feel like a barrier and cause anxiety for both the child and the parent. So a lot of anxiety, a lot of control, uh, a lot of fear can be present in that. And I think the child can feel that anxiety, and anxiety that is not owned by the parent. This is really important, really important. And what I mean by owned by the parent, I'm going to break it apart so it makes sense. Is to say to my child, the difference between not unowned anxiety and owned anxiety sounds like this. Unowned anxiety looks like, oh my gosh, this is going horrible. What's happening? You're out of control, right? My anxiety is on you. You're the problem. You're causing it. That's unowned anxiety. Oh my gosh, what's going to happen? You're using drugs. You're self harming. You're refusing school. How's this all going to end up? We're going. We're running into a wall. Disaster, catastrophe. Owned anxiety looks like I'm anxious. This is my stuff coming from my background. I get triggered. Yes, I have to deal with your behaviors. That's part of the job. But my upregulation, my snapping, my yelling, my nagging, my whining, my begging, whatever it looks like, that's mine. I need to own that. That comes from my background. You didn't cause it. And again, it's not the words that you say, it's how you think about it. If you think the child is the cause of your sleepless nights, the child will think they're a problem. Unowned anxiety gets interpreted and internalized by the child as something is wrong with me. Owned anxiety can be dealt with a little bit easier. Still, it leaks a little bit, but I the child of a parent who owns their anxiety can say, "Yeah, my mother, my father, they were neurotic. They had tons of anxiety. They know it. They talked about it. They apologized when they snapped at me or yelled at me, or when they were helicoptering around me, right? They were able to own it. And I have to deal with the fact that I was born or adopted by human parents. Children can do well in that. But when a parent is of the belief that the child is the cause or the solution for anxiety, the child has a overemphasized idea of their power in the world. They become there's a narcissistic development there. They feel it doesn't always look grandiose in terms of its narcissism. It can look very depressed or very codependent, but they have an over valuation of the power that they hold in the world. They think everything is about them. I have some of that. You have some of that. I told a story recently where after a Broadway show, I was very tearful because it touched on something very personal. And when a friend of a friend asked me outside of the theater how I felt, and I was very emotional, I was very embarrassed. And my adult daughter, Emma, came up to me and said, "That wasn't you. That was him. He was the one feeling awkward. You didn't do anything wrong." She said to me, "If you were on the other side of the equation, if somebody came out of a show very emotional because it touched on something very personal to them, how would you have reacted? I said, I would have been totally enthralled, totally present, all in. And she said, exactly. So I have some of that, right? I think that the way people respond to me, I find myself catering to people and walking on eggshells and worried about people telling people the truth and setting clear boundaries and standing up for myself, right? I struggle with that. And that's my work. My work is to sort through where that comes from. And I think it was Don Miguel Ruiz, the author of the Four Agreements, that said this. It might have been somebody else, but I'm sure he knows it also. Mental health in a large degree is realizing that how somebody else reacts to you, it tells you more about them than it does about you. That's awakening. That's getting free of the anxiety. That's either not having been programmed to believe that you were responsible for the people's feelings around you, or you, in essence, have done some healing with that. And that I just said something I want to go back to. That's the biggest thing that I could tell you, watching or listening tonight, or listening on the podcast, is that when you go into the world believing that you're responsible for everybody's feelings because you've been told, indoctrinated, programmed, engineered by your parents, because they told you when they were sad, when they were upset, when they were worried, when they were proud, when they were happy, when they were scared, when they were frustrated, when they were angry, and they told you it. They told you those things because they wanted you to change your behavior. They wanted to, in essence, make you responsible for their feelings. So then you, as a child, get wired to believe that you're responsible for everybody's feelings. If people get mad at you, it's your fault. If people get sad or hurt, it's your fault. So you lose access to the truth. You lose access to yourself. You lose access to your voice. You lose access to your boundaries. And then we look at children and we say, why are they so susceptible to peer pressure? And the answer to that question is because that's how we raised them. We raised them to believe that they were responsible for our feelings. We told them how we felt in an effort for them to take it on, to change their behavior or to continue their behavior. That's a really important thing. I almost can't say anything more important to you than that on any of these broadcasts. That is the fundamental issue that we're treating. Now, there are other issues also involved in everybody's life, but that issue is the fundamental barrier to the authentic, or what psychologists refer to as the real self. It is the fuel behind the false self. It is the fuel that leads to feelings and thoughts and ideas and parts of self being expressed through symptoms, substance use, other addictions, process addictions, self-harm, depression, other anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive, on and on and on. There are other things involved too, but that idea, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're treating. And you have it too, and I have it too. It's something that's of paramount focus and important when we're thinking about psychotherapy. All right. Somebody writes, I'm a former graduate of Evoke's Wilderness Therapy Program. I've continued therapy and feel like I'm plateauing with my therapist. It often feels like I'm receiving advice. If the therapist doesn't stop giving advice, would you recommend going as far as to find a new therapist? Yes. Sarah, could you find my article on my, I don't know if it's on Evoke or my own website, on what to look for in a therapist, and share it there? Let me say this. Number one, the answer is yes. I would definitely encourage you to consider finding a new therapist. But before that, this is the most difficult thing I can say about this, and I believe it's true. You don't really know. You don't really know how good your therapist is until you tell them that you're upset with them. And I don't mean rage. or over the top. If that's true, that's fine. But I'm just saying to say to a therapist, I don't like this, I don't want that, I'm frustrated or hurt or sad or disappointed by the things you said last week or the thing you just said to me now. That is the moment when you find out if your therapist is what I would call good enough. But most of us don't want to do that because, again, we have been trained not to tell the authority figures in our life. This is huge. We have been trained and conditioned not to confront the authority figures in our life because when we did, it did not go well. They made us the problem again. They told us how we were wrong. They told us how we misunderstood, how we didn't understand their intentions, how we were overreacting, how our filter was skewed, right? And because the big people, typically parents, responded to us that way in childhood, most of us, because they hadn't worked out their own issues, they hadn't worked on their own ego, that is to let it go to some extent. They hadn't become responsible for their own lives. And so they needed to be the good ones. I wrote this recently in a post on social media that the shared story in most dysfunctional families is that the parents are good. The parents have to be good. So we have really bad experiences. My children have had bad experiences with this. I had horrible experiences. I still have horrible experiences with this today. It won't go well. If I tell my one remaining parent what I'm upset about, it doesn't go well. Sometimes she opts to just say, well, maybe I should just go away. Sometimes she says things like, I guess I'm just the one to be picked on. I guess we're going to talk about, right? She does a great job of trying to gaslight me. So, with all of that background, all of that programming, all of what I just said about the paramount issue, the fundamental issue in psychotherapy, if you can summon up the courage to take the risk to tell, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. But if you can, tell the therapist how you feel about what they're doing. And if they respond with the ways that your family of origin did or other authority figures tend to, which is like all the ways I just said, then you know you have one that's not really doing their work, that doesn't really understand the fundamental transformational relationship of the psychotherapist and the client. And moving on is necessary. If they respond with things like this, listen to this, folks. This is so big. If they respond with, I'm so glad you told me. I'm honored that you would share with me that, especially at the risks, the risks that you might be feeling, given your family and your background. Thank you for telling me that. Thanks for letting me know what I wasn't doing. I'll try to do better. If that's how they respond, then you got to keep her. Not a lot of them will respond that way. Most often, the therapist will defend themselves. They'll explain to you what they really meant, why they're doing it. They'll justify their approach or their specific behaviors that you're confronting them on. And then no matter how professional it sounds, and then you have an immature therapist. And moving on is probably in your best interest. Now, I'll say one last caveat before I move on. If you have no confidence in your therapist being able to tolerate that, I would still hold out a little bit of skepticism that it might just be your own fear. But there's a very good possibility that from all of your interactions, your therapist won't ask in an enlightened, mature adult way. You don't have to say it. In fact, you don't have to say it at all. You don't have to do anything that I say. But that's my thinking about it. And I will tell you this. You know, for those of you that are longtime listeners, for those of you who know my work, that thing that I just shared with you, when I told my therapist, I remember the first time I told her something she did that upset me, and she responded this way. I'd never had an authority figure in my life respond to me that way. No teacher, and I had some good teachers. No parent for sure. No aunts and uncles. But when she said to me, I'm so grateful that you would tell me, and I'm so sorry that I hurt you. I was The anger and the hurt almost dissipated immediately. There was nothing to fight about. I was upset when I said it, but I had to say it. And I've said it since then another dozen or so times over the years. I've been seeing her for 23 years. So there've been some snafus, 24 years. So there've been some snafus. But that ability on her part changed my life more than any other one thing in psychotherapy. Everything I tell you today, every broadcast that I offer, every sentence in the books that I write, I can tie back to that. It was at that moment that I started to get to know who I was, because it could be heard, because the other person was adult enough and capable enough of honoring me. Now, fast forward 20 years, my therapist wrote the preface of The Audacity to Be You, if you haven't read it yet, the foreword for The Audacity to Be You. And in there, one of the things she says, if the therapist knows what's right for you, find a new therapist. Good therapists, she explains, want to know what you think and feel. They want to understand what's going on for you. They don't want to impose it on you. So that was a lot of answer to a great short question. Somebody writes, can you make some comment on the specific obstacles that a child on the spectrum with a lack of empathy and cognitive rigidity may face in their progress in wilderness? Do they usually take longer to understand themselves or others? Yes, I mean, the foundation of any neurological difference is the person who has it has to come to terms with it, right? If you have ADHD, there are going to be things in life that are going to challenge you. If you're on the spectrum, there are going to be awarenesses and processes that you don't experience. And so part of it is learning schemas, learning, knowing what you don't have and finding accommodations and ways to kind of interact and interface with the world and with others in a way that makes sense. You have to know what you don't know. You have to have some idea of what you don't know or what you don't have. So it can take longer, but the real barrier to most of this work is shame. See, I have a learning disability. It will never come out in any of these because it has nothing to do with oral or verbal skills. It has to do with numbers, long sequences of numbers. In fact, I can, if you tried to spell a word to me out loud, orally, I wouldn't be able to get past 2 or 3 letters if you said it with any kind of speed at all. I can't retain it. It's a very, very small learning style learning difference, learning disability. So it doesn't come up in many situations. But what I've learned as an adult is when my wife is telling me to spell something, I have to tell her, please go slow and speak in twos or threes, 2 at a time or 3 at a time at the most, because I won't be able to hear 4. That's a trivial answer to your question about somebody on the spectrum, but I'm just trying to illustrate the point. You have to know that there's a deficit. You have to know that there's a difference. Deficit might not even be the right word. One of the things that my own son says, who identifies and is on the spectrum, says is everybody's on the spectrum in some ways, right? It's not this perfect line where everybody on it has all of the traits of somebody. The farther along the spectrum that they go, has every single trait. It's more like a scatter plot, if you know statistics and graphs, right? There are things that I have about it. He said, Dad, you have some spectrum issues. And at first I was very defensive, thinking, and I started naming reasons why I don't have it. He said, you're right. You don't have those characteristics, but you have this and that. And he named a couple of things. And I'm like, yeah, that is common to people on the spectrum. And one of the things that he says about it being a deficit, he said, we on the spectrum don't think of ourselves as having deficits only in the context of mainstream society. But the it's kind of like folks that are hearing impaired or deaf. They will often tell you that getting their hearing back might not be better for them. They don't feel impaired or less than. And so we have to broaden our ideas about neurodiversity. But my answer to the question is the child has to come to terms with the fact that they process information and relationships differently, for sure. And to address some identify with and discover and utilize some accommodation, some ways to work around it. All right, I'll take one more question. Somebody writes, we are having difficulty in finding the right language to use in communicating boundaries to our children. Try not to use imperatives. Can you advise on this? I can, as a matter of fact. In fact, let me see if I have it. I'm going to try this. I'll edit this out when I do the podcast, but I have it. Yes, here's number one. That's very blurry, and I'm sorry for that. But I will. On the screen, it's very blurry. Don't worry about that. Here are the 5 suggestions for boundaries that talk about language. The first one is boundaries are not for changing others, but derived from a parent's sense of self, as in, this is what I feel good about. This is what I need in this situation. Okay, that's number one. Number two, don't make it about being right, but rather about being a self, as in, I may be crazy, old fashioned, or an idiot, but this is my boundary. This is the most powerful position we can take, and it sets an example for children resisting peer pressure. That's number two. Number three, similar to key two, to point two, don't explain your decisions or boundaries to your children in an effort to get them to agree or be okay with the boundary. Don't say, quote, I am doing this for your own good, or, quote, because I love you. That's point number three. There's 5 of them. Point number 4, listen to them as much as you're able, and no more, but as much as you're able. Respond with genuine empathy and allow them to be angry, hurt, or upset with you and your decisions, as in, I get it. You're angry, upset, and it makes sense. I'm sorry for this. This is so hard, and I'm glad you're telling me how you feel, or simply listen and be silent. That's number 4. And number 5, don't use your emotions to try to get your children to change. When you do this, you're telling your child, this is what I talked about earlier, that your feelings are their responsibility. This will lead them to believe that what others think and feel about them is theirs to manage. Don't say, I am angry, scared, or hurt as a substitute for boundary setting. And then in the end, I wrote this. Lastly, we can say that we are sorry when we fail. Every parent has limits, and every child will discover the end of these limits. We can say sorry when we fall short of the ideal, and with this, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all: what it means to be human. I know that was hard to see for those of you that were watching live, but those 5 keys to boundaries for me are critically important. And Sarah, you can if anyone wants those 5, I'm happy to send them out. I'll make sure that you have them. You can also download them, Sarah, from this software. So, all right, I hope that helps. It's very, I feel I need, this is what I want, this is my boundary. It's not this is right, or trying to argue or justify the decision, or even using emotional intensity to try to make your point. All right, folks. You can point your cameras to the phone, or your phone cameras to the screen if you want to look at the respective website pages for each of these upcoming announcements. My 2 books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Amazon and Audible. If you want to do a deep dive in your own work, the next in-person Finding You option is June 21st through 25th. We also have an online option, which is May 19th through 21st. That's coming up real soon. The one after that is July 14th through 16th. The online ones are half the time and about a third of the cost, and you don't have to travel. If you want to come back and do a second Finding You, we have one called Returning to You. The next option for that will be in October 11th through 15th. We're doing a Finding You in the UK in June. I am running it a full weekend, June 23rd through 25th. There's a waiting list, but you can check that out if you want to. For any other custom finding connection for couples and parents or for finding families, contact intensives at avoketherapy.com or just check out the QR code there. We have support groups for wilderness families and alumni. The next offering is May 18th. That's this Thursday at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. We have one a month that's just for alumni of our program, of our wilderness program. May 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is the next offering for that. And if you are an intensives alumni, we have one support group per month. The next offering for that is June 13th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time Zone. Contact Sarah D at avoketherapy.com or visit evoketherapy.com/family involvement for more information. If you want to coach for parenting, individual, couples, or families, we have coaches that are immersed in the attachment-based model for clarifying boundaries, communication skill building, parenting and family dynamic issues, wraparound services for people coming home from treatment. We have over 40 coaches that have all kinds of experiences and approaches. Contact coaching at avoketherapy.com if you're interested in that. We encourage all current families to try out 6 parent 12-step support group. Excuse me. I'm going to say that all over. We encourage all current families, all current parents to try out any combination, 6 of any combination of the 12-step support groups, Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. You can also try RefugeRecovery.org, which is a Buddhist-inspired recovery program, less of an emphasis on a higher power, or the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI.org, has free classes and resources in your area. All of these podcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast, or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Finding You there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the rebroadcast there. You can find Evoke Therapy programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter and Instagram using the handles at Evoke Therapy and at Dr. Brad Reedy. And you can find the Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, the blog. I just did the last blog. You can find new blog content each week on our blog page on our website. If you want to give back for people that can't afford treatment or therapy, if that's something that you feel in your heart you want to get back to, our 3 charitable partners that we also donate to are ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, or the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. All right, folks, my next broadcast will be on depression and anxiety, and I think that's probably the most applicable mental health issue that I can imagine. So I'll be talking about depression and anxiety this week, May 18th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, and you can check our website for any upcoming sessions that we have going forward. All right, folks, thank you for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. And for on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thanks for showing up and being willing to do your work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you on Thursday night. Take care. Bye-bye.